Video game bosses can vary from a standard enemy that is bigger and has a large health bar, to grueling skill checks which require patient study and practice to overcome. Sometimes bosses serve purely as plot devices or to advance the story, and sometimes they can be all of the above. Today we'll be taking a look at some of the best and worst examples of bosses in games from the past 20 or so years to try and dissect what makes them great experiences or a frustrating mess. Starting with the best of the best and what they get right. This is in no particular order and is based just on my opinion. Only doing 5 top bosses is quite hard to narrow down, so I may do a further video with some more examples if people wanted to see that. Be sure to let me know in the comments. The balance of a single boss is quite hard to get right. Too easy a fight and it may be over before you even realise it started, but too difficult and it may feel like trying to break through a brick wall with a wet baguette. If a single boss's balance is hard to get right, then it makes sense that fighting more than one opponent at once can make for an incredibly frustrating time. Enter Ornstein and Smough. These two are the gold standard for a duo boss battle, and while many future games would try to replicate this kind of 2v1 boss fight, including other From Software games, very few have managed it as well as the OG Dark Souls. The Ornstein and Smough fight works so well for multiple reasons. They each have a distinct weakness which the other makes up for. Ornstein is smaller and more agile, while Smough is big and hits like a truck. This fight is a true test of skill and is a considerable challenge for newcomers to the Soul series. If you try to be greedy in getting damage on both the bosses at the same time, you'll most likely end up getting whack-a-mole by Smough and skewered by Ornstein. You'll need to try to separate the two by utilising the environment and taking them down one by one. But don't get complacent. If you lose focus or don't keep your eyes on both of the bosses at the same time, then you will again be in for a rough time. Don't think that you can let up when you finally manage to defeat one of the bosses either. When either Smough or Ornstein dies, the surviving boss will absorb the other's power and you will have to face a supercharged foe, depending on which one you killed first. Many players will get frustrated with this fight initially, however there are very few fights out there that will ingrain a sense of patience and strategy when facing superior numbers. While the Batman Arkham series featured mostly beat-em-up style combat with simple inputs and was more about timing counters and combos than anything else, the bosses are usually quite mechanic heavy and require more than just button mashing. Nowhere is this more true than with Mr.Freeze in Arkham City. This fight is one of the hardest in the entire series and definitely the most challenging of this game. Mr.Freeze is on this list because you are required to think on your feet and utilise every gadget and tactic in your arsenal to damage him. The main gimmick of the fight is this. Once you've managed to get a hit on Freeze a certain way, like sneaking up on him from behind, he will initiate a countermeasure which will prevent you from doing the same thing twice. On easy, this is not much of an issue, as you only need to come up with 3 unique takedowns to win the fight. However, on hard, you need to deliver 8 unique takedowns on Freeze, all while he tracks your footprints and is constantly limiting your options. This game of bat and mouse creates an atmosphere of desperation, as up until this point you've probably been relying on pummeling everyone into submission. But now you cannot win head on and need to adapt to come out on top. Needless to say, from a gameplay perspective, it's also a stroke of genius to force the player to get to grips with all of the tools at their disposal, when quite often people fall back on 1 or 2 options out of the 15 that they've been given. While I don't like including multiple bosses from one game series or similar sets of games, I feel like I have to include General Radahn in this list. There is one bad thing I can say about Radahn, which is that he's a bit too easy because you fight him quite early on in the game. If he was fought later on in the endgame, somewhere after your first visit to Leyndell for example, then to me he would be a contender for the absolute best boss of any game, never mind in a Souls series. There is a significant build-up to this fight, with you walking around Redmane Castle and meeting all of the heroes and adventurers who've travelled to take part in the Festival of Radahn, hosted by his old friend Jerrin. The lore behind Radahn tells of an incredibly powerful and intelligent leader who was so gifted in the arts of gravitational magic that he was able to halt the very stars in their tracks. His immense power did not shroud his compassion, however, and when you learn that Radahn wanted to learn gravitational magic so that he could still ride his trusty steed despite growing many times too big for him, you'll probably start to feel bad that you even have to fight him. This fight starts with Radahn firing volleys and a rain of arrows at you from a distance, and as you close the gap he will ride towards you and start cleaving at you with his gigantic gravity-imbued swords. He will often dismount during his combos, and you need to be very careful of spacing because he's so massive. When he reaches about half health, Radahn will roar and leap high into the sky out of view. There is a silence as the skies that used to be bright red turn to a dark blue, and you will see a searing comet in the sky, which will come right at you as Radahn crashes down, his full power being unleashed. Radahn uses more magic and longer combos in his second phase, and if you're not careful he can easily take you down at this point in the game. To tie the lore of this battle into the gameplay, you can even summon a whole host of NPC allies to make this fight easier, or go it alone for more of a challenge. But either way, it is an incredible spectacle. This fight is the insane climax of the Metal Gear Solid series, and sees Solid and Liquid Snake having a fistfight on the highest deck of the Outer Heaven ship. The fight itself is not a test of skill, unlike many others on this list, and is actually quite hard to fail. But the reason I think of it so highly is the way it plays out. The twin snakes take turns punching and kicking the shit out of each other, all while they keep pumping themselves up with more and more nanomachines just to keep themselves going. This fight originally starts as a cinematic, and you just watch them go at it. When you do finally get control of Snake, you'll notice that the Metal Gear Solid 1 theme tune starts to play, and you will be in for an absolute nostalgia trip. As the fight progresses and you get down to lower and lower health, you will start to move through the different entries, with Metal Gear Solid 2 and the tanker incident, and then the best theme tune that's ever been written in Metal Gear Solid 3 with Snake Eater, and finally you will arrive battered and broken, barely able to punch or take a hit, with Metal Gear Solid 4 and its sad, emotional theme tune. It's at this point that the realization will start to dawn on you. You'll realize that this is the end of Metal Gear Solid as you know it, and I cannot think of a better way to end the series than this. It may not be very challenging or interesting mechanically, but the spectacle and overall experience of this fight is unlike anything else I've ever seen in a game. God of War 2018 and the sequel Ragnarok are not light on bosses. Kratos will encounter giants and gods and dragons across both games. Some of these are better than others. Balder's first boss fight in the 2018 reboot was a great way to open the game and show that there are other extremely powerful beings in this new world, even if his final fight was ultimately quite disappointing and more quick-time event than boss. One particular group of bosses you might encounter if you go down the path less travelled are the corrupted Valkyries, winged warriors who are supposed to shepherd fallen soldiers to Valhalla. There are numerous Valkyries to find, and each has a standard set of attacks plus one or two unique moves that you will need to learn to defeat them. Once you have defeated all of the Valkyries across the realms, you will need to travel to their council and interact with the rift in the middle. But you will get a surprise as the Queen of the Valkyries, Sigrun, grabs you from inside the rift and slams you into the floor to start the final encounter with her. This did actually make me jump, as I wasn't expecting it the first time, and you are thrown into the hardest challenge of the game. This is an absolute test of skill, your reactions, memory, and patience. On the harder difficulties, this fight can take you upwards of 10 to 15 minutes of near perfect play to beat. Sigrun has an extremely large health bar and deals very high damage. Even on normal, she will kill you in seconds. If this was just the first encounter with a Valkyrie and Sigrun was a standalone boss, I would actually probably say that she borders on being unfair. However, what makes this fight so great is that even though she is extremely tough to beat, you've been preparing for this fight without even knowing it. Remember all those unique moves the other Valkyries have? Well, Sigrun has all of them, and will use them randomly. If you've been paying attention to the previous battles, then you already know which way to dodge, when to block, and when to punish, and that's what makes this fight so good. Gnar in Ragnarok is very similar and shares many moves with Sigrun, but has additional mechanics to switch it up a bit for the sequel, including Bifrost attacks. However, to me, Sigrun is the contender for best boss in gaming, just because of the way she's set up. Now that some of the best bosses have been covered, let's have a look at some times when developers miss the mark, either through laziness, difficulty, or just by forgetting what their fans want to see from an epic showdown between characters. When you have as many bosses as the entire Soulsborne Kiro Ring series does, it's no wonder that some are considered the absolute pinnacle of challenge or engaging storytelling. It is equally no surprise that some of the bosses will be a swing and a miss. Maybe they're too easy, or buggy, or just not a good fit for the style of game you're playing. The Bed of Chaos falls into the latter category. While Dark Souls does feature a lot of exploration and some of the best world building and level design in history, what it does not feature is good platforming. Movement feels quite clunky in Dark Souls 1, and there are often unclear borders to ledges where you can stand on. Sometimes you can run right up to a ledge and be visibly hovering off the edge without falling. Other times you'll fall if you so much as think about trying to look over the edge. The Bed of Chaos is essentially a platforming boss. You need to hit 3 weak points to kill it, and after hitting the first one, the floor starts to fall away beneath your feet, and you will fall to your death if you make one wrong step. While you're trying to cross the room to the other weak point, you will also be dodging sweeping branch attacks from the boss itself, and if one of these hits you, you're going straight into the bottomless void. After hitting the second weak point, you will need to kill the actual bug in the centre of its body that is manifesting the powers of chaos. However, the entire arena drops away in front of you as you try to run here, and you need to know exactly where to land on the roots below to avoid an instant death. This boss requires boring trial and error and does not depend on a player's skill to beat. This falls foul of the entire Dark Souls mantra of get good. To the warriors who opened it, the vault was just a container of tentacles and disappointment. You know a boss is bad when the developers reference how bad it was in the next game of the series. The first Borderlands main antagonist is Commandant Steele, a siren who wants to open the vault on Pandora to claim the riches inside for the Atlas Corporation, and you spend most of the game being hindered by her as you search for the vault key. This comes to a head when Steele gets hold of the vault key and manages to activate it with her siren powers to open the vault. She is then impaled by a large tentacle and dragged into the mouth of the destroyer, which has emerged from the vault and eaten. You're actually now supposed to fight the real final boss of Borderlands, a giant calamari. Steele is set up to be the big bad throughout the game, and you never even get to fight her at the end. She is unceremoniously killed, and you are now supposed to deal with the destroyer instead, which is an extremely boring and potentially very long fight. The squid is just a huge bullet sponge and has a big health bar. But that's about it. If you manage to hide behind some pillars every now and then, well, it's hard to even get hit, never mind die. And to add insult to injury, when you do finally beat the final boss of the game, you will most likely be rewarded with some ammo and common rarity weapons. Tentacles and disappointment indeed. Arcade bosses have a very long and dated history of being unfair, or on the really, really strong side of balancing. This was due to the format of the early games, mostly being played on an arcade machine which you had to pay money to play. When fighting games started to gain popularity in the early 90s, some developers like Midway, who developed the original Mortal Kombat, saw this as an opportunity to make their game as hard as they could, featuring multiple bosses which can and will destroy you the first time you encounter them. And this was at the end of a game where you've already beaten the rest of the roster. This frustration led to repeated attempts to overcome these roadblocks and finally finish the game, and more attempts meant more coins being gobbled up by the arcade machine. During the arcade era, I can sort of understand the challenge being put in to extract as much money from players as possible during their attempts to beat the likes of Goro and Shang Tsung in Mortal Kombat 1. What I do not understand, however, is this design philosophy being carried over to home consoles and PC fighting games. Nowhere is this more apparent than Mortal Kombat 9 and Shao Kahn. The ruler of Outworld does extremely high damage with all of his moves, some of which feature hyper armor so you cannot trade attacks with him while he's in their animations. He will input read and counter with unreactable punishes if you jump at him or try to go toe to toe with him. The boss is so punishing that the way most players initially end up beating him is by gaming his AI with taunts or teleporting behind him for single hits of damage before retreating and spamming this over and over again. Of all the bosses on this list, Shao Kahn is easily the most unfair when you're trying to beat him the intended way, or with a character that cannot spam certain moves in an agonizingly slow and boring test of patience rather than actual skill. The Witcher series is no stranger to boss fights. In The Witcher 3, you'll face dozens and dozens of beasts, monsters, and people that will put your skill to the test. The Witcher 2 also features multiple bosses such as the Kayran, which can be a considerable challenge, and Letho, who is a Witcher just like you and will use the same tools and tricks that you do. Most people on their first playthrough of The Witcher 2 will hit a wall when facing Letho in the Elven Ruins. When you first go to the objective point, you will not know that this is a boss fight, and you will have no time to prepare your oils and potions as you will enter combat immediately. Letho is more of a gimmick fight than many others in the game, and the key to figuring out how to defeat him is being patient, and even then it's difficult on hard. As mentioned, Letho has access to all the same tools that you do, and uses them liberally. He will Ard, have a Quen shield up for a lot of the fight, throw bombs at you, and dance around with his sword. The reason that I consider this fight a bad one is that you can severely hamstring yourself just by playing the game how you want to, in an RPG. If you've spec'd Geralt into a sword-heavy build, you're seriously going to struggle against Letho. If you haven't stocked up on throwables like bombs and knives while playing, you're going to struggle. If you're still at level 1 Vigor, then you are going to struggle. The fight with Letho requires you to build a certain way to be able to get past. But you won't know this ahead of time, and if you haven't been making regular saves to reload and stock up or upgrade, then you might be out of luck and have to spend 5 or 6 hours getting beaten down by him. Not to mention, my biggest gripe with this fight is that you have to win to proceed, but then in the following cutscene you lose anyway. In which case, why should you need to beat Letho at all to progress, just for you to lose in the next second? It's one of my biggest bugbears in boss fights. I do find it quite ironic that one of the best games of the 2000s, arguably one of the best opening entries to a game series in history, concludes with one of the absolute worst boss fights I can think of. Batman and the Joker are perhaps the best representation of order and chaos ever devised. Batman is a peak specimen of a human being, stronger, faster, smarter, and with more resources at his disposal than the clown prince of crime. Batman's unwavering virtue and adherence to his own moral philosophy is what keeps him just about on the side of good. However, this often gets exploited by characters like the Joker, who has no moral code to speak of and is more than willing to kill innocent people or cause untold amounts of damage in his criminal ventures. The Joker is the main antagonist of the first Arkham game, and you will encounter him multiple times and get to know his motivations and character throughout the game. But just as the game's final act is concluding and you finally get to battle head to head against your lifelong nemesis, the Joker transforms into a Titan and the boss fight plays out exactly the same way you've fought Titans throughout the rest of the game. Except you have to grapple him every now and then to get him back into the arena. And then you punch him really hard and it's over. That's it. No cryptic puzzles or moral dilemmas. No battle of wits against the most iconic villain in all of comic book media. This is one of the worst boss fights in gaming history because it doesn't stay true to the characters it involves. The Joker's danger is not that he is a physical threat to Batman, and he knows that. Turning the Joker into Bane is not what makes him threatening or an engaging adversary. And to me, this is the single biggest missed opportunity from the franchise that nailed a fight like Mr.Freeze in later entries. Well, that is it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Feel free to leave a comment of which your favourite and also most despised bosses of all time are, and I will see you in the next one.